Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today's episode is another one about St. John Henry Newman. Now, it's well known that Newman was an accomplished poet and possibly the best prose writer in English of the 19th century. He also wrote 2 novels, of course. It's less well known that he was a very accomplished amateur musician, that he was involved in the planning and commissioning of a number of different churches, and so had the need and opportunity to develop a definite philosophy of church architecture. In short, Newman had many opportunities to meditate on the relationship between beauty and the spiritual life. Today's guest has written a book on this subject. It is titled Unearthly Beauty, The Aesthetic of St. John Henry Newman, and it's out from Gracewing in the UK. Before I get to that, though, I have to ask for your help. CatholicCulture.org is, like so many other nonprofits, taking a bit of a financial hit during the coronavirus pandemic. And it's unfortunate that we need to ask for your help because, of course, so many of you are in tight times yourselves, but we simply can't continue our mission without the help of our users. So thankfully, some of our generous boosters have made this easier by helping us to set up a $31,000 matching grant. We're calling this the Easter Challenge because it goes through the entirety of the Easter season, right through Pentecost. And it means basically that any donations up to $31,000 will be matched. Right now, we still have about 26 or 27,000 more to go. So if the CatholicCulture.org website or these podcasts have been helpful to you over the years, I hope you'll consider helping us out with whatever you can. You can do that by going to CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. And of course, being a nonprofit, your donations are tax deductible. Now, as I've said often before, at Catholic Culture, we pray for our donors and for all of our users daily. But we have a special prayer list associated with our Easter campaign, which you can see if you go to CatholicCulture.org and click on the Easter Challenge banner at the top of the page. We've asked our users around the world who are ill or impoverished because of the coronavirus to send in their prayer intentions so that we can pray for them. And we've put that list on the campaign page so that you can also join in prayer for all those in need as well. So even if you can't donate, please, I urge you, if the current global situation has put you in special need of prayers, to send me an email at podcast@catholicculture.org, and we'll add you to the list and start praying for you. So as I've said, today's episode is on the aesthetics of St. John Henry Newman. My guest today is Father Guy Nicholls. He's a priest of the Birmingham Oratory and the founder and director of the John Henry Newman Institute of Liturgical Music. He is a lecturer at Oscott College, the Birmingham Diocesan Seminary, and he is a fellow at Blackfriars, Oxford. Father Guy Nicholls, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm sort of curious about the approach you took in writing your book because Newman never wrote a single work focused entirely on aesthetics, so you had to pull together his thoughts on the matter from a great number of different sources, and that must have involved quite a bit of synthesis.
Yes, it's a classic idea of the Cardinal's himself in what he calls the producing of an idea, in which he takes a particular concept and gradually from different angles, he looks at it and sees how these different angles build up a whole picture, and the way in which these different partial pictures interrelate with each other, and so help to contribute to a much more balanced and thorough account of what the entire concept is about.
So perhaps we could start with the title of the book, Unearthly Beauty. You discuss his views on earthly beauty, something he valued, and yet had some concerns about if it was something that did not lead to the experience and the desire for unearthly beauty. When he's speaking of earthly beauty versus unearthly beauty, well, obviously unearthly beauty ultimately is the beauty of God, but is earthly beauty simply any beauty on this earth, or is he specifically referring to a sort of deceptive beauty?
I think it's probably better to start, as Newman always does, of course, with his relationship to God. So when he talks about the dangers of earthly beauty, he does so from the platform of having already established quite how beauty properly perceived should lead us to God, who is the author of all beauty. So when he looks at earthly beauty, he is already, if you like, he's already hardwired, in one sense, to see in it a route towards the author of beauty, because he has a very teleological understanding of being. So he understands that he exists for some purpose, and that purpose is one that has been created for him by God. And that purpose is for him to find God and to come to God. So beauty is one of the most important ways in which Newman sees God drawing us towards him. That's the position from which he sees all beauty on earth and how it should be understood. That's why he therefore understands that there are certain kinds of misleading ideas of beauty, and indeed some forms of beauty which can be understood to lead nowhere, as he puts it, other than themselves, so that they don't actually have a proper direction and purpose other than ending in exactly what they themselves seem to present.
When he speaks of certain kinds of earthly beauty being deceptive, does he mean deceptive in that they aren't actually beauty, or in that they are genuinely beautiful and as such do in themselves reflect something of God and yet are put to an ungodly purpose?
Yes, he does see all beauty as coming ultimately from God. For instance, when he talks about forms of beauty that lead nowhere other than themselves, he has, I think, two particular kinds of aspects of beauty in mind. One is what you might call the purely natural beauty of, say, the human form as conceived of by, say, the ancient Greeks. And he sees this kind of beauty as just leading to nothing other than itself. He still sees it as beautiful. He's not saying that it isn't beautiful. Far from it. He has a very strong sense that this is beautiful, but that he understands that the patterns that it embodies, that form of beauty embodies, don't seem to draw you away from what they image, namely the human form in its most beautiful. They don't draw you towards the one from whom that beauty comes. It's rather that idea that you get in some ancient Greek thought, that man is the measure of all things, and which, of course, then resurfaces in the Renaissance in Italy. And so that sort of idea of beauty is something which he sees as very real. And certainly, of course, it comes from God, because where else does the human form come from but God? But it can be perverted by being made to look only towards itself and be seen only within the terms of its own self-referencing.
There's the danger of having as you say, self-referential perfection, or something that aims only at its own perfection and nothing beyond that.
Yes.
But there's also this view in Islamic art of deliberately making something imperfect so as to not pretend to perfection, which only God can do. So it's interesting to contrast, what exactly is the difference there. So for Newman, the problem is not, a sort of earthly perfection, but does there need to be nevertheless, a sort of wound to it?
I don't think that Newman thinks that there needs to be any kind of wound to it. I think he does regard earthly beauty, which has no reference to its origin and its final end, as being in some way perverted and therefore, if you like, wounded. So that in a sense, it's a kind of inversion of what the Islamic idea of beauty in art would suggest. Although, of course, I suppose that's interesting there because as far as I'm aware, and I'm certainly no expert in Islamic art, but I think that the blemishes that they incorporate are generally speaking, imperceptible to the
Yes,
untrained
that's a good
eye.
point because I've never noticed them or had
Yeah,
them pointed out to me. I've just heard that concept.
yeah, that's right. That's right. So that in a sense, it's just simply an acknowledgement in fact that beauty in this world cannot be
Hmm.
perfect. And it's just trying to reproduce that fact in a very concrete way, rather than trying to emulate and, in a sense, therefore, perhaps even to supplant the divine beauty of which it's supposed to be some sort of reflection. I think that may be what's behind the Islamic idea of human art and imperfection.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's certainly not the case in what Newman sees.
There's another distinction made in the book, which is very interesting, although it might seem somewhat abstract at first. Newman speaks of things being real or unreal, and there's even a line.
Yes,
There's even a
yes.
line in the book from maybe it was one of his friends, I forget, saying that for Newman it was perhaps less damning to say that something was unreal as opposed to that it was untrue. So what does that mean, and how does that
Yes.
connect to his views on beauty?
That's a very good question because it really gets to the heart of the matter of what Newman means by reality and truth, because those two, in Newman's own understanding, are almost impossible to separate from each other. And that's why it is that you can actually quite authentically, in translating, when you can use the words truth and reality interchangeably. So when he famously, of course, composed an epitaph for his memorial stone in the cloisters at the Oratory in Birmingham, he had in mind to inscribe on that stone ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, which of course first sight you would say is from out of shadows and images into the truth. But in fact, it just as valid a translation. In many ways, it's more appropriate to Newman to say from shadows and images into reality. I think that the reason for that is because for Newman, truth was never just an abstract concept. It was always something that directly and fundamentally had an impact on the individual person. That God, in fact, when we say God is truth, he is the fullness of reality. And in that reality, he makes a significant effect upon the one who approaches him. So that the truth of God is encountered precisely in understanding that he really is. And that I think is what Newman means by talking about reality. And therefore, this kind of translates into a whole language of our human interaction with Almighty God. And that when we interact with God, we're not simply doing so as with a being that we can have an intellectual grasp of, but rather with a being who confronts us with the challenge of his love for us and his desire for us to come to him, which involves, of course, as this is what Newman understands, of course, from his own life's story, which involves a great deal of serious undertaking. For Newman, there was no question at all that you could simply just make an intellectual assent to God from the first moment you understood what the word God meant. You had to come to a full understanding of the reality of that by sometimes a very arduous journey. And it wasn't just an intellectual one, but also, of course, a moral one. You can't just simply come to a relationship with God by recognizing that he exists. You've got to know what he has done for you and for the whole race, and what the consequences of his action are for what we must do. And I think that's the reality that he's understanding.
So how does this reality versus unreality relate to beauty?
That's a very important point, of course. I think that for Newman, it's a question of how beauty will either move us on or draw us into some kind of world, an inner stasis, if you like, of just simply contemplating beauty for its own sake. He does talk about this in an important sermon, actually, that you yourself picked up the reference to, which is the sermon on the danger of accomplishments, where he talks about the danger that we can take so much delight in the faculties that we have been given and in those things that we can produce from them, which will themselves arouse certain kinds of emotional responses, that we can rest in those but not actually move forward into the action, which in fact is what we should be doing anyway. As he puts it, we could, for instance, read a novel, and the novel could be full of very edifying principles and characters who act extremely well, but the reading of it could just be simply an act of purely internalized enjoyment and having no consequence at all on how we actually then go on to conduct our lives. And I think he sees that as a danger, as a form of unreality. So the reality is all to do with how we act, how we are changed in order to act and to act well.
I was very struck by this sermon, and I think it made me understand Plato, some of Plato's warnings about art a little better. I don't know if Plato was saying exactly the same thing, but I think there's something in common there. I see it in myself very much, not so much with music, I am a musician, but with stories and with philosophy, with ideas, with the indulging of beautiful ideas without acting on them.
Yes.
He talks about how God gave us this faculty of moving from sentiments and ideas to action. And so if we habituate ourselves to disconnecting the two, then what happens when we actually need to act? We may feel the necessary sentiments and then not act. And he connects this to effeminacy, which was also very striking and something I had never heard before, the disconnect between sentiment and having noble sentiments and actually acting. So I'll quote him here. He says that poetry and music, quote, are especially likely to make us unmanly if we are not on our guard, as exciting emotions without ensuring correspondent practice, and so destroying the connection between feeling and acting. For I here mean by unmanliness the inability to do with ourselves what we wish, the saying fine things, and yet lying slothfully on our couch, as if we could not get up, though we ever so much wished it.
Yes.
Very striking and, for me, convicting.
Yes, that's right. He's always, of course, extremely concerned about the dangers of intellectual achievements and intellectual enjoyments when divorced from any sense of personal engagement and commitment. And he sees, I think, that it's a danger that particularly likely to befall those who have very strongly developed faculties of that kind. So, as I say, those who are very well skilled in music and in art and in the use of language, they can, in fact, just simply take so much enjoyment in those things themselves and in producing some kind of effect or some particular kind of perfection. Again, coming back to that idea of a perfection which leads nowhere other than itself, but doesn't lead beyond.
It's remarkable. You know, we have so many warnings about in the early church about the theater and, you know, different art forms and things like that on a moral level. Here we have a saint who was an accomplished artist himself. He was a poet, he was a novelist, also a accomplished amateur musician. And here he's speaking about, under the assumption that the art he's discussing is actually inculcating noble sentiments. So he's even setting aside in this sermon novels that are immoral, for example. He's speaking only of the dangers of good novels, so to speak.
Oh, definitely, yes. I mean, that's the whole point he's making. I mean, in a sense, he thinks the point isn't worth arguing about immoral art of any kind, because it should be obvious to anybody, and certainly to his congregation.
Yes,
it would have been. They wouldn't have needed any persuading about that. But of course, the point he's trying to make is that don't just think that because you avoid any directly and deliberately immoral forms of art, that thereby you have avoided all danger. And that's not because art itself is misleading in itself, but rather because we can be misled by certain assumptions that we make in encountering it. That's the point that he wants to make. As always, with Newman, he's trying to go into a deeper level of the human psyche than perhaps most of those whom he was preaching to would normally have gone. But he does it in such a way that they can easily grasp exactly the point of what he's saying. So much so, in fact, that very many people commented that when they were present at his sermons, they felt as though he was speaking to each one individually himself, which is a most interesting observation. And in fact, always a very good sign that the preacher has an extremely accurate grasp of the human soul.
Yes, and of course, it's also a sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit, as in, Pentecost.
Yeah, well, of course, that's certainly true, of course. But obviously, as you know, I mean, grace, even the grace of the Holy Spirit works through nature.
Yes.
And what Newman is doing, of course, is he's applying all the gifts that God has given to him in terms of his penetrating intellect and his powerful rhetorical gift in order to reach the innermost hearts and minds of those who hear him, with a view to changing their ways of life and their understanding of where their life should be taking them.
There's a connection here to another danger that he raises in the idea of a university, which was the most striking part of that book for me. He talks about the danger of reducing moral virtue to good taste, in this idea of moral beauty, where I remember reading this last year, where he speaks of some people who would condemn Christian morality as being motivated out of fear of punishment, and this was somehow gauche and unaesthetic, as opposed to simply doing things because they are right or wrong. But he says that this risks misconceiving morality entirely.
Yes, that's right. That was, of course, a trope in the Enlightenment. And, of course, the persons he particularly identifies in the idea of the university as holding that kind of view of beauty and morality is Shaftesbury. He sees Shaftesbury as the one who, in fact, kind of inverts that relationship between beauty and truth. He says all beauty is truth. Yes, it's the point, really. It's worth quoting that. As Newman sees, this is quoting from the book, such an ethical philosophy actually usurps and redefines the meaning of truth in relation to virtue. For Newman, truth is to virtue as the all-seeing and judging presence of God is to conscience. But for Shaftesbury, the old-fashioned pagan virtues, the venustum, honestum, the decorum of things, that is, the elegant, honourable, and seemly motives for acting virtuously, are the principles which should form and guide virtuous judgment and action. In these qualities, the pagan qualities, he identifies not only the ground of virtuous action, but the meaning of truth, claiming, as he does, that the most natural beauty in the world is honesty and moral truth, for all beauty is truth. And Newman critically observes of Shaftesbury's views that, quotation, there is no doctrine contained in them which is not in a certain sense true. Yet, on the other hand, almost every statement is perverted and made false, because it is not the whole truth.
So this is that unreality that we were talking about.
Absolutely. This is a very, very good example of how unreality corresponds to, effectively, perversion of truth.
Let's go ahead and start talking about Newman's personal life and his relation to beauty in concrete ways. Well, actually, if we could just say something quickly about Newman's personal beauty, which you discuss in the first chapter, of his comportment, his voice, his speaking style, and the impression that made on others, because I think that's worth talking about.
Yes, it is, because it's something which I think probably came across to people in different ways. One of the things which I've been interested in always in the imagery surrounding Newman, his iconography, if you like, I should say, is the way in which there are so many different styles of picturing him. And I contrast, for instance, the famous Richmond drawing, which is probably the most famous of all the drawings. It was made in 1844, so just shortly before he became a Catholic. And that's the kind of heroic sort of Newman. And he was compared by one of his brothers-in-law, one of the Moseley brothers, to Caesar as having the bearing that inspired that kind of hero worship that one learns about in the ancient world with someone like Julius Caesar. And I think that that's probably what inspired that particular view that you get from Richmond's drawing. And that's almost the same in the very fine marble bust by his old school friend, Richard Westmacott, which is the original is in the Oratory in Birmingham as well. I think that gives a very similar kind of impression of Newman, sort of idealized Newman, but idealized not just simply to try and make out that he was the most handsome man in the 19th century or anything like that, but rather to express through a certain kind of beautifully proportioned features, one who was able to inspire a great deal of love and a longing to be imitators of him and to share certain aspects of his view. So, I mean, Newman was obviously seen as a great leading figure in the 19th century, both when he was an Anglican in his preaching in St. Mary's, and then also, of course, obviously as a Catholic and as the founder of the Oratory. He inspired many men to follow him in his religious ways. And then on the other hand, you see, you get an image like others, like there's the spy cartoon of the 1850s, which shows him as a very much more bent, stooped sort of man. And indeed, that stoop was part of his character. He's described, again, I think, by his brother-in-law Mosley as walking along in a rather stooped way, very fast, as though with intent on a world quite beyond where he happens to be. And again, also very beautifully summed up by Copleston, who was the head of the college, Oriel College, when Newman was newly elected there, and who said, seeing Newman walking out in, I think, Christchurch Meadows one day, said, "Ah, yes, numquam minus solus quam cum solus," never less alone than when he is on his own. Again, this idea that Newman was somehow wrapped up in the affairs of another world so much that he didn't seem to be fully engaged with the world around him. And I think that idea, again, of this urgent speed to his walking, the slightly stooped posture, I think, again, shows that the way that people perceived him very often led them to portray him in slightly different ways as well.
So we're touching on the beauty of his holiness as well there.
Yes, I think so. And I think that obviously came across in different ways. That's interesting, actually, that the beauty of his holiness is something that is commented on by several people. And generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that they are female commentators. So people like Maria Giberne, who was, of course, a lifelong friend of his, and some of the other ladies who came to visit him commented very much on the beauty of holiness that radiated from him, and obviously must have lent a certain kind of luster to his appearance as well, even if he wasn't necessarily the kind of Apollo figure that perhaps the Richmond might suggest. But it does represent a real aspect of Newman, which is the point, which obviously must have been seen by those who commented on it. I think that you do get the sense of the beauty of holiness in the way that certain artists have tried to capture that image. The earnestness combined with an obvious sense of deep kind of reflection of the beauty of God through his features. And of course, not only that, but also through his voice. I think it's important. We can't so easily understand that simply because, alas, we have no recordings of his voice at all. We have plenty of pictures of what he looked like, and we also have plenty of descriptions of his voice and the quality of his voice. But unfortunately, we can't get any closer to it than just those descriptions. But it was quite clear that the quality of his voice was such that people found profoundly moving and pleasing.
And his preaching style was noted for having a soft intensity to it, wasn't it?
That's right. Yes, he didn't generally raise his voice. He spoke quite quietly. And again, I think this must have added to that impression that he was speaking to each individual person in the congregation beneath him. I say beneath because obviously the pulpit is quite high, raised up in St. Mary's. If you've ever been there, you'll probably know. But that, I think, must have increased that impression that he was speaking to each person individually who was there. And of course, obviously, he would have a pretty well, I mean, given that he was raised up quite high in the pulpit, he'd have a more or less uninterrupted line of vision to virtually everybody there. I think that it would be almost certain that he would be able to see the faces of everybody there. And more importantly, perhaps, I think most of the people there, by far the majority of people there, would have had a clear vision of his face too, combined with his voice. That must have been quite a strong impression of direct personal intercommunication, which of course is something, again, which he thought extremely important to aim at throughout his life. So yes, he didn't ever kind of address crowds in that sort of way. At least, I mean, he did obviously have to address crowds on several occasions, but delivering lectures, of course. But when he did so, he never did so in any sense as just looking at an indiscriminate group of people in front of him, but always with a strong awareness of the individuals who were there. And as far as possible, he would like to know as much about them as he could. So obviously he was able to do that when he was preaching at St. Mary's. He would know the parishioners. very well, because he obviously made a point of being pastorally very deeply engaged with them. But also, of course, a lot of the young men who came from the colleges, even though he wasn't necessarily preaching to them a lot of the time, they would, I think many of them would make themselves known to him if they possibly could, because he obviously had made a great impression on the colleges, given that we know that the masters of several of the Oxford colleges deliberately moved the dinner hour in their colleges in order to coincide with the evening service at St Mary's, thereby to prevent their undergraduates from going to listen to Mr. Newman preaching in St Mary's. So we can see, therefore, that the impression that he made on the young men of Oxford was quite an intense one, and one, therefore, that many of his opponents, religious opponents, must have thought was very important to try and neutralize in that way.
Well, let's talk about Newman's own experiences, his own aesthetic experiences. There's two connections in his early life: his love for his sister Mary and his experience of traveling in Sicily, both of which gave him a sense of the beauty of paradise in many ways.
Yes, in fact, it's the combination of those two which is most telling. Each of them separately, of course, was a powerful influence in his life. That's true. The experience of knowing his sister's personal holiness. And it was a holiness that he knew instinctively, I suppose, did not belong in this world. He knew that it wasn't going to last. And by that, he went on to explain, after her death, that he was not at all surprised that she died so young. He was devastated, of course, so much so that he could not speak of his sister Mary even as much as 60 years later without tears coming into his eyes. That was the intensity of the effect of Mary on him, and indeed the depth of his love for her. But even so, he was not surprised that she died, because he said she was too good for this world. And he didn't mean by that a kind of goody-goody sort of china doll, but rather that he knew there was something intensely godlike about her. The innocence, in his estimation, spoke of a closeness to God and of a desire for God, which therefore was drawing her constantly towards God. And therefore she didn't fully belong in this world. And he knew that if she did grow up to older maturity, she would indeed have found living in the world a great trial, which she never had to do, because obviously she died while she was still young and had been living entirely within the bosom of her family. So Newman was very struck by this effect of her holiness and the beauty that he identified in that. So as well as, of course, other people identifying it in him, it's very important to recognize that he identified it mostly in her. And that, in fact, I think had a powerful influence on the way he sees personal holiness and beauty in the remainder of his life. But then, as you quite rightly say, there's alongside that a quite different experience, and that is natural beauty, which goes again right the way back into his youth, because you get examples of his writing about the beauties of nature, even when he's still a young man in his late teens, early 20s. But then the crucial experience, of course, is the one which he had in 1822 and 1832-33, which is when he went to Sicily with his great friend Hurrell Froude and Froude's father, the Archdeacon Froude, largely on account of Froude's health, because Hurrell Froude, his close friend and companion and contemporary at Oriel, was a sick man. It was thought that a prolonged tour through the warm Mediterranean climate would actually do his health some good. Anyway, the real reason that he went was in order to keep company with the Froudes. He found it a most fascinating experience, and part of the reason, I think, for that was also that he was aware from the time that he reached the Mediterranean. We have to remember that this is the first time he'd even left England, when people didn't travel around a great deal necessarily, as we're more used to doing, of course. So he was encountering a vast swathe of experiences which were entirely new to him. And yet they weren't entirely unfamiliar, because as a classicist, of course, he was very familiar with the literature of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, which, of course, were all set in the Mediterranean world. And so he was able to sense, in many ways, a kind of latent familiarity with all these things, which was being brought out into the open. So again, this is another kind of aspect of something becoming real. It would also be an important part of his understanding of the importance of coming to a grasp of reality, not just a notional idea, but a real grasp of the world and the concepts with which he was already intellectually familiar. But now in Sicily, he found this an absolutely fascinating experience. The natural beauty of the Sicilian landscape was something that utterly overwhelmed him. He hadn't had any experience that had prepared him quite for the intensity of this. So much so that after they left Sicily and went to Rome, it was from Rome that the Froudes, father and son, went back to England. And by the original plans, of course, they should all have gone back to England together. That was the intention. But Newman was so completely mesmerized by the beauties of Sicily that he just could not resist the urge to go back and see the beauties of Sicily again, despite the fact that this must have been quite an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do, to set off, and never having been abroad before, in a world where foreign travel wasn't something that easily, the world wasn't set up in that sort of way as is for us nowadays, among people that he didn't know, in, of course, a religious world that was completely alien to him as well, of course, to set off entirely alone and unaccompanied into this world of Sicily. Well, it was an adventure such as he had never had before, and in a sense it was something that he would never quite repeat in that way again. And it was, of course, to leave a lasting mark upon him, in a way physically as well as mentally and spiritually, the effect of the illness that he experienced. But that's a slightly different matter, of course. The thing that was so important here is the way in which the beauty of Sicily, certain great kind of prospects he was aware of, because it was this kind of the vastness of the terrain laid out before him and the ruggedness. It was especially around near Mount Etna, the great swathes of land, the hills and plains and towns stretching out into the distance from his vantage point. While he was looking at that, he was suddenly struck by the memory of his sister Mary. And that is one of the most fascinating things, because you can imagine the novelty, the intensity of this experience being so utterly overwhelming and all-absorbing that for the memory of somebody who was now dead a few years and from a very, very different part of his life, suddenly coming so forcibly into his mind is very striking. And he himself, of course, was very struck by it too. And it was exactly this point, as you say, about Eden, about the idea of natural beauty itself expressing to us a sense of a longing for something that had been lost. And it was that, I think, that united it with the thought of Mary. Was obviously the loss of Mary was still something which he felt deeply and, of course, expresses very movingly in several of his poems around about that time.
Yes, so he wrote some poems about Eden at this time,
yes,
right?
And many of them also, in fact, in mentioning Eden, also mention Mary too. So he obviously makes a very strong connection in his own mind between the sense of sadness and longing that goes along with beauty. I think this is something which he found most striking, that beauty isn't necessarily something that makes us feel kind of superficially happy all the time, but rather can actually strike a very deep note of longing and loss. And I think that it's because he associated that with the loss of Mary that he came to see that also as a sign of longing for a lost Eden.
Let's talk a bit about Newman's connection with architecture. Yeah. He was involved in the commissioning and planning of a number of churches, in particular one in Dublin.
Okay, well, I would certainly want to say before moving on to Dublin that it's very important to begin with the church he built in Littlemore. Not necessarily because of the visual effect of it, although there are some important aspects of that, but maybe that's not the most important thing. I think the thing that matters most is that the church he built in Littlemore became the occasion for him composing and delivering some of his most important sermons, the analogy between church building, church services, divine worship on earth, and heaven. And he developed that idea in several of the sermons that he preached in the late 1830s and early 1840s at Littlemore. So although Littlemore Church at first sight is a fairly plain building by comparison with many other churches which were to be built in the 19th century, it nonetheless does represent an important point of development in Newman's own understanding of the relationship between the architecture of earth and the worship of God on earth, as a setting for the worship of God on earth, and the worship of God in heaven, and the architecture of heaven, if you like, as well. This, of course, is what he puts into effect quite readily when he builds his church in Dublin, which is a very, very different kind of building. You'd hardly know that they were built by the same man. So obviously where Littlemore is a little 19th century early Gothic revival church for an Anglican parish and worship. Dublin, of course, is very much a basilica of the Paleo-Christian type, especially found in Rome and parts of Italy, and designed, obviously, of course, for Catholic worship and to express Catholic ideas of beauty in art and worship as well. So what Newman wanted to do was to create a building, as he had done in Littlemore, so also he would do in Dublin. He'd build a church that was not excessively expensive. Because one of the things that he wanted to do always was to make a building that was going to leave no great burden of debt on those who were going to make use of it. But at the same time, he was very anxious that such a building should be beautiful and inspiring. And so, although he doesn't preach anything like the same kind of sermons in Dublin as he had done in Littlemore, it's quite clear that he's putting into effect a lot of the same ideas of the analogy between earthly beauty and divine beauty, and also the place of worship in that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned him not wanting to leave any debt, because it just speaks to his balance as with his great love of the arts and yet his concerns about some of the potential dangers. There's a line in the book where you quote him as wanting to cultivate the beautiful with frugality, and that this was his general approach.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that really speaks to his balance and his discipline over his own attachments.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, in that way, he was also conscious of differences between himself and some other Catholic contemporaries. Notably, of course, the one I suppose that everybody thinks of is Augustus Welby Pugin. Of course, Pugin was perhaps the greatest of the architects of the Gothic revival in England. And like Newman, of course, he also was a convert, but with perhaps a rather different kind of route into the church. Whereas Newman's, of course, was through his study of the fathers and the early church and the councils of the first 5 centuries. It was really medieval architecture that inspired Pugin's journey into the church. In many ways, I think there's no reason at all why there should have been any great falling out between Newman and Pugin, except that the way that it developed in Pugin's own mind was that he was, on the whole, inclined to be rather extravagant, and that the kind of details which he delighted to reproduce were often quite extraordinary, intricate, and very demanding of craftsmen and builders. And so it tended to be rather more expensive than what Newman was generally engaged upon. But the effect, when properly fulfilled, was magnificent, and Newman himself was, undeniably deeply struck by Pugin's work, and he'd said so when he was at the consecration of perhaps one of Pugin's best-known churches, which is in Cheadle, and one of the few that Pugin was able to build without any constraints at all on his spending, because it was built entirely at the expense of the Earl of Shrewsbury, who was a very rich Catholic landowner and benefactor in those parts. So, in fact, Cheadle Church is built without any limits on what Pugin was able to achieve. And Newman himself said, this is absolutely wonderful. He said it's the Porta Coeli. Again, an interesting idea, the gateway to heaven. So showing that what Newman saw as important about a church is that you should sense from it that you're being directed towards heaven, and that the actual striking effect of the beauty is precisely that, as to lead you on, to draw you in towards the portals of heaven itself.
Newman was not a medievalist aesthetically, it seems. He appreciated Gothic architecture, but he was not interested in merely antiquarian sort of purist revival of that for modern England.
That's right, yes. I think he would have been quite happy to have gone along with Pugin if Pugin had been happy to go along with him. But I think that the break came eventually because Pugin wanted to do certain things in a medieval style, and Newman saw that Gothic needed to be adapted more elastically, if you like, towards the needs of the 19th century than Pugin himself thought really ought to be the case. And other architects came along later in the 19th century who did just that with Gothic architecture. They did actually adapt the styles and principles of Gothic architecture in such a way as to make it more suitable for the needs of 19th century Catholic devotions and the accessibility of the sanctuary, because one of the things that really drove Newman and Pugin apart was the whole question of how approachable the altar should be seen to be. And I think that was probably one of the big differences between them in the end. But you're right, it's rooted in the first millennium, particularly Newman's case. And so that's why his church at Dublin, you can go into it now and you can think, gosh, you could be somewhere in Italy, say in Ravenna.
Right. So one of the devotional issues changing the needs of architecture would be exposition of the Blessed Sacrament.
Absolutely right, yes. And he comments on that, Newman does, when talking about the drawbacks of Pugin's style, that it doesn't really allow readily for the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament without certain visible drawbacks. If the monstrance is placed too close to a large east window in the kind of standard English medieval style, then you can't actually see the Blessed Sacrament because the window glares too much. So you can't actually see what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. And that's quite apart from the fact that there might also be a screen, if Pugin has his way, that is.
Newman came from a musical family. He had early studies in the violin and composition and was known to his friends as a very accomplished amateur violinist throughout his life. It's something that he kept up into his older years and especially came back to with a renewed vigor when his friends, I forget if this was in his 70s or in his 80s, gave him the gift of a very nice violin.
Oh, it was a little earlier than that. It was the 1860s.
Oh, I see.
And the interesting thing about that is that you have to remember that for practical reasons, Newman effectively stopped playing the violin from the time that he came back to England as a priest until just after he founded his school. So there wasn't really very much either practical need for violin playing or indeed much opportunity because he was so busy as a priest. So it wasn't that he eschewed it in any way ascetically. He just didn't have the opportunity to do so. Music played a different part in his life as a priest, and certainly there was a lot of it in the early years, but it was all principally in church. It was only really with the founding of his school in the very end of the 1850s, after he came back from Dublin, that the possibility started of training boys in playing the violin. So it was in the early 1860s when his school began to grow and the boys themselves wanted to start learning musical instruments, that he took up his violin once more and he began to play with the boys and encouraged them also, of course, in their exploration of music. There's lots of wonderful accounts of how he would bring in scores of various pieces, often very old-fashioned scores, even by the standards of the 1860s. These are things that he'd picked up when he was an undergraduate in Oxford in the 1820s. And he would try and introduce them to people like Haydn and Mozart. And there's always said the great kind of aim of all this was to get them to know Beethoven. But he said on one occasion, you see, that he was talking to two of his old friends who were still Anglicans, actually. And he was commenting on the fact that he'd picked up his violin once more, the violin that he'd had since he was age 10. So it was quite a long time that he'd had it. And he was finding it difficult to play. The strings were digging into his fingers. It must have been uncomfortable for him, I think. And so he happened to mention this to these two friends. And they decided to club together and to get him a new instrument. And they sent him a couple from a dealer and said, play these and see which you'd like, and you can have it from us as a special gift. And he was very moved by this and deeply touched. And indeed, he felt rather guilty that he'd said so much about it, because he thought it sounded as though he was trying to solicit a new violin from them, and he hadn't, of course, been intending to do anything of the sort. But at the same time, he didn't want to refuse such a nice gift, and it was very useful to him. It was a lovely instrument, and it kind of inspired him. He said that he was playing it an awful lot. He took it out to Rednall, the country house he was so deeply attached to, where the community cemetery is also based. And he would play there in the garden, all by himself, just enjoying the sound of making music with nobody else around to hear but himself. and then going back into town to the oratory and playing with the boys in a small orchestra that they were forming, which they would also use for some public occasions as well. So they would have school plays in which they presented some music as well alongside, and also some of the religious functions. So, for instance, some of the processions that they had as Corpus Christi time and St. Philip's Day, in May and June, and then reasonably nice weather.
He made some comments at this time on the effect of playing the violin on his intellectual life and his work.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. That's when he's writing back to church about the effect that this has on him. He says he thinks that it will increase his power of working because he feels that he never works so well as when he has been playing the violin. It's obviously helped to enliven his mind and to make all sorts of connections work faster and more effectively, even than when he hadn't been playing the violin beforehand. That was his experience. And he reflected on this because he found it such a striking phenomenon in his own life. Well, perhaps thought is music, which is an astonishing thing to say, because it does imply that there's a very strong interaction between the way in which music affects the one who's playing or listening to it and the way in which thought is shaped. Because he does indeed say, of course, that language and thought are inseparable from each other. You have to think things out in words, in language, in order to make thought shaped properly. He thought the same thing true of music, and he did think of music as a language, much for those reasons, because he recognized that it spoke in some way of something beyond just its own simple elements. And there's this wonderful passage in one of his university sermons in Oxford, the last one he preached in Oxford, as a university sermon, in which he talks about the power of music, which comes from just a handful of notes, and that the way in which those few notes can be arranged in order to produce such a magnificent and powerful effect. In many ways, it's not dissimilar to the effect that he describes of the scenery in Sicily, as inspiring the sense of something that is lost, that you're searching for, and it makes you want to find it even more urgently. And he says music has much the same effect, that when you're playing it or listening to it, you feel drawn into something that is much, much deeper than just the mere passing notes, much more powerful. And you don't quite fully understand how that can be so. But he says he understands it, therefore, to be signs of what he calls echoes from our home, our true home, the things that have escaped from a higher sphere. So music, in fact, is something, again, which is given to us as a special sign of something that has got a greater fulfillment yet. And the purpose for which we're given it here is not so that we might enjoy it for its own sake, but so that we might find through it a way to the higher world where we're destined one day to come.
There's also a quote, and I can't remember the context of this, but I just wrote it as a note, that he described music as having quasi-sacramental efficacy. What does that mean?
That's a very interesting quote. It's actually a reported quotation. It's something which I think probably was picked up verbatim, but we can't be absolutely sure, but it sounds like him. It was on the occasion of the blessing of a new organ at the oratory in the 1860s. And he's reported by a journalist. So obviously the words that he said on that occasion, we haven't got them in a form that's written by him. But I think there must have been quite a good stenographer, because what you read does sound like him. But we have to be careful not to assume everything to be exactly the right words. But when he talks about the quasi-sacramental efficacy, what I think he means there is he says that the organ is, as an instrument, it is the best representative that we have on earth of the voice of God. And he contrasts it with the effect of stringed instruments, which he says are particularly evocative of the human condition. I think, again, that's probably one of the reasons why he has such a strong liking for Beethoven's music, because I think he sees Beethoven as expressing something very powerful about the human condition. And the organ, on the other hand, which is an instrument, of course, that Beethoven doesn't actually produce anything for himself, does, in this association with the church, and I think also in the character of the sounds that it's able to produce, and within the volume of space in which it speaks, the resonance of a large building, he says is much more akin, in our kind of analogous understanding of the majesty of the voice of God. And so when he says it's quasi-sacramental, he also brings in another image from Scripture when he talks about the way in which King Saul, in his black moods, is capable of being brought back to some degree of good humor by David playing the harp for him. He does understand, therefore, that music has a power to soothe and also to be as a kind of balm for the soul in difficulty.
What does Newman think is important in music? We know his tastes, his favorite composer was Beethoven, but what for him are the most important elements of good music?
Well, I think, first of all, its intelligibility, the fact that music can strike one in such a way that far exceeds, as you quite rightly put it, the meager elements. So therefore, there is in it an inner power which comes from beyond its own limited origins. I think that's the first point. So I think in a world in which we tend to think that everything is only really going to be the product of whatever parts it's made of, he wants to see that music is probably the greatest example of something which so exceeds the sum of its parts as to be inexplicable in any other way, and that it actually comes from somewhere beyond the limits of this world. So I think that's the first and most powerful reason, the fact that it has that effect on him, and he sees that as being one of its greatest characteristics. And then, of course, it is immaterial. Of all the arts, perhaps it's the one that is most definitely not composed of any physical parts. And of course, unlike, say, the language of words, it's not just something of mere human construction, but something which goes beyond the limits of human. It enriches human thought in a way that cannot necessarily fully articulate, because words don't actually suffice for that. I think that's another reason why he sees music as so important, because it surpasses the power of words in so many ways as well. Well, of course, he also sees that music is, in a sense, therefore, because of the structure in which we actually frame music, and which we perceive in music as we understand it, as we perceive it, that structure he sees as being analogous, in a sense, to what you might call the architecture of the spiritual world. So an architecture that is not merely constructed of physical objects, such as stones and bricks and mortar, but is rather an architecture, in a sense, constructed of spiritual realities.
We could talk a little bit. I don't want to get too bogged down into his views on liturgical music, but there's one aspect that I'd like to ask about, which is his views, which probably relates to his attitude towards chant, his views on what he described as primitive visual art and music, and what he saw as some of the advantages of those in certain contexts.
Yes, I think when you talk about the visual arts, of course, he says that primitive art doesn't attempt to try and become totally absorbed in the images of this world. I think that's why he talks about the importance of primitive art as not attempting to replace the beauty of God or to lead away from the beauty of God into a dead end, a cul-de-sac of purely natural beauty as such.
And how would this connect to music?
Yes, when it comes to music, now that's a very important point. You're quite right to ease on that, because in music, he does, on the whole, see the power of development as being more important there, or what it releases in terms of music's intelligibility. I think one of the things that, when he talks about primitive music, of course, he doesn't have very much experience. People in the 19th century were only just, I think they were more or less the first century, really, in which there was a regular experience of music composed in centuries past by composers long since dead.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think that was an important aspect of the way in which music was understood. So we, of course, have much, much more experience of that now. I think probably it's true that we would probably have much more experience of music from the past than even from the present. Well, Newman, of course, belonged to that world in which the experience of music is something that came from the past. On the whole, the experience of things that were leading up to the fulfillments of his own age. So he saw a kind of culmination of all sorts of earlier forms in later music. So the place where he deals with this most is a passage in his first novel, Loss and Gain, in which he talks about the analogies between ancient music and ancient architecture, and how forms of ancient music and ancient architecture are incapable of being developed beyond certain limited fulfillments. So that you can't increase, for instance, the size of a Greek temple. The proportions won't allow you to do that. A Gothic church, on the other hand, can be. And it's one of the interesting points he makes about Gothic architecture, about the importance and beauty of Gothic architecture. Its kind of elasticity of form and its capability of almost indefinite expansion. With music, he makes a similar kind of point that chant, he says, can't be expanded very much. Of its nature, it's limited to what the setting of the words will allow, and you can't really expand it too far. So he says you can't have a setting of the Gloria in chant that is indefinitely long, which of course you can in later music. By the time you get to polyphony, for instance, you can have settings of the Gloria which are many, many times longer than those of chant. And of course, ultimately you get to the extraordinarily large forms of things like Bach's B minor, which is, of course, it's a setting of the Gloria which lasts for well over 30 minutes. And Beethoven's Missa Solemnis is not far off that in form as well, although that's not a work that I think Newman had much familiarity with. He did know Beethoven's other shorter Mass in C.
The more primitive liturgical music would have avoided, it seems, the danger of which he speaks in the idea of a university of music sort of ultimately taking precedence over the worship of God in the liturgy.
That's right. Yes, as he says, architects sacrifice the rites of the Mass to their architecture. So he's talking about Pugin and rood screens and, as you say, the place of the monstrance and devotions and such like. But musicians sacrifice the words in their own way. So he does complain about the way in which certain musicians will manipulate the words of the liturgy. He talks about some composers doing that, or by representations of Christ in musical forms, which again was considered somewhat daring, if not shocking, in the 19th century certainly among Christian commentators. So, for instance, there was a conversation that took place between Newman and a friend of his from Oxford about the propriety of Beethoven setting the part of Christ in his oratory, Christ on the Mount of Olives. Was it actually right to do so? Newman doesn't disagree with what Beethoven has done there, though his interlocutor certainly thinks it's rather daring to voice the God-made man in that way. But Newman does also complain about the way in which musicians will stretch the words and create ever larger structures for their own, according to their own lights and their own architectural ideas of music, rather than according to the needs and expression of the words themselves. He talks about what he calls, in one place, scientific music, which is an unusual phrase to use, but I think by that he's referring to such music where the form itself is dictated by musical architectural principles rather than to the liturgical ones. I think he's thinking of things, for instance, like Haydn's masses, are certainly very much appreciated, but it's well known, for instance, that Haydn uses symphonic structures very often in his masses, which of course are not strictly speaking related to the liturgy per se, but they're obviously related to Haydn's art as structures. I think that's what he's thinking when he talks about scientific music.
Yes, and this ran to his taste in music, but he understood that it wasn't necessarily appropriate for the liturgy.
Yes.
I'd like to move on quickly to music in the rule of the oratory. The oratory, it's not something I know a great deal about.
Oh, yes.
But you say in the book that it plays quite an important role.
Yes.
And as do many things which Newman considered to be worthless without holiness, but which make holiness more effective.
Precisely, yeah. Which, of course, in many ways brings us back to that point, the dangers of accomplishments. But he does say that those accomplishments which without holiness are worthless can nevertheless, in the context of holiness, they can be quite healing and can enhance the power of holiness. So he says, just as an orator, for instance, if he's got something worth saying, it can be more effective if his rhetorical powers are put to good effect. But rhetorical powers on their own, of course, don't guarantee a good argument. That's the kind of analogy that he makes there. He sees very much that point in the oratory with beauty. He says that beauty on its own would be of no benefit without holiness. But given holiness, then beauty in association with that can be much more striking and enticing as a means of drawing people to God. And in this way, of course, he was following very much the teaching and practice of St. Philip Neri. St. Philip's whole approach to beauty, especially in music, above all music, was precisely to draw people in and to kind of weave a magic spell such that they would be drawn towards God. One of his great followers, a musician called Neri, wrote a collection of music that was dedicated to the memory of St. Philip after his death, and he talks about music as a form of enticement, allurement is the word, and the way in which Philip would use the best musicians among his friends and bring them to play so that people would be drawn to hear this beautiful music, and then they would be allured into a greater love of God, which Philip himself would then weave into the use of the music by his preaching, by his encouraging sacramental practice, particularly, of course, drawing people to confession and to Holy Mass and Communion. So that's the way I think that Newman sees and understands the oratory's tradition being formed by St. Philip, so much so that he says that it's interesting to note that in the 17th century, both the Jesuits and the Oratorians more or less vied with each other, especially in Rome and in post-Reformation, counter-Reformation Italy and the rest of the Catholic world, for attention and through the use of music and sometimes the visual arts. But he says the thing that's interesting about it is that whereas the Jesuits quite self-consciously used that to entice others, they always eschewed the use of it for themselves. Whereas, he said, in the case of the oratory, it was quite definitely intrinsic to what the oratory is about. So the very nature of the oratory demands that there should be fine music and beauty in the liturgy, because that's something which is part of the very expression of what the Oratorian love of God and neighbor is fired by.
It's worth noting, just a side thing, that the proliferation of devotional music in the oratory allows for more freedom in musically speaking than if you were just doing liturgical music. So as strange as it may seem, in the oratory hymn book, Newman sets a number of hymns to melodies that he simply were some of his favorite melodies from Beethoven and other classical composers, which in some cases, when I was sitting and reading through them at the piano, seemed quite unsuited for, congregational singing, but they were simply melodies he liked. And because these were not used in a liturgical context, there was a certain amount of freedom there to do that.
That's right. Yes, of course, he was a bit of a pioneer in that sense, because nothing at all like that had been done in England, certainly in Catholic England. In some ways, it's also a bit of a departure from his Anglican days, because he did, as an Anglican, speak rather sniffily about popular music, which was used by some churchmen, but not by the Tractarians, by and large. And of course, the use of hymns, metrical hymns, is something that came about largely later in the century in the Tractarian movement, after Newman had left it, but not without certain kind of foundations that he himself had laid down even as an Anglican. He translated a lot of the breviary hymns into English and tried to promote their use. But he also realized, this is a point he made to one of his correspondents, that the problem with breviary hymns, even when translated into English by some of his contacts, his great friend, of course, Edward Caswell, who was not just a great translator of hymns, he was also an original writer of his own poetry too, and a lot of his hymns are still sung in Catholic churches, even to this day.
Caswell came up in my previous episode because I did an episode in Holy Week on Pergolesi's setting of the Stabat Mater. So I mentioned that the translation most of us are familiar with is that of Newman's associate Caswell.
That's correct. It is. That's the one that is still used. A very good example of how he still survives in use to this day. Yes, well, Newman was trying to do was say, well, these are very good, but they're not necessarily going to strike most of the ordinary Catholic. He wanted to try and incorporate a different kind of note, which, of course, and the point that you've already made is important to bear in mind, is outside of the liturgy. Very important to recognize that distinction, because it's a distinction that we no longer really live with. We tend to mix liturgy and devotion so thoroughly that we can't really separate them out. We haven't got the mentality left to do that. But for Newman and his generation, of course, this was something which came absolutely naturally, that the liturgy was absolutely laid down, something that did according to the traditions that were handed on and according to the books. But around that, and in order to complement the liturgy, you could have devotion. And devotion, in many ways, he sees as an important, not as a substitute for liturgy. It's the important thing that I think probably you have to realize Newman was very subtly recognizing this. In a lot of his correspondence, which I quote in the book, he does deal with this question of the relationship between devotion and liturgy. And also in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk as well, the importance of devotion alongside the liturgy, but never instead of it.
Yes. It's interesting that in an age of ours where the liturgy has been often debased, there's also the sort of disappearance, not of private devotions, but of what you might call recreational devotional activities. In other words, getting together purely just to sing hymns. Instead, we stuff the Mass full of hymns,
yes,
where we only sing one or two verses instead of the whole thing. But the Mass is not really about the hymns. It should be more about singing the Mass. And hymns, there should be other opportunities in which to sing hymns together, but we don't really do that anymore.
No, we don't. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we don't fully understand what Newman was about. And, of course, another thing I must say, although we've touched on it a little bit before, but I think it's still worthwhile saying, is that when it comes to liturgical music, one of the things, again, which Newman is sometimes often pointed out as being an example of, is a rather negative attitude towards liturgical chant. And this, I think, is the result of some of the correspondence that he had. Some of his companions were much more obviously devoted to chant and to the promotion of chant than he was. But I think that also some of his contemporaries were much more negative towards chant than he was as well. The chant serves the liturgy. It doesn't impose itself on it. Whereas later forms of music, he sees the dangerous tendency of them to impose themselves and their own forms upon the liturgy and to distort the liturgy as a result. That's the danger that he sees, and that's where he doesn't see that as happening with chant. But he doesn't at the same time necessarily fully appreciate the chant in the way that we understand it. He does complain sometimes about some of the modal forms of the chant. He doesn't like things that aren't in a diatonic scale, major or minor scale.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. He's such a modern man in so many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, his tastes were completely formed in the first decade of the 19th century. It's not just Beethoven either, by the way, because in many ways it came to Beethoven late in life, he says. It's Handel, especially in England in the first decade of the 19th century, was still Mr. Handel, who was the great composer of the past. So Handel and Haydn would have been the composers that shaped his ear. And of course, there wasn't much room in their musical world for the modality as we understand it.
In your book, there is a quote from Newman: "The Little Oratory is intended as a recreation, hence music has so much to do with it. It is, I think, an outbidding of the world, in all ways a doing what the world does on Christian principles." Can you describe what a Little Oratory session, for lack of a better word, would look like under Newman?
Yes. What he would do is he would employ his fathers, the small community who worked with him, among whom there were always good musicians. You may also remember that one of the things that he said while he was still in Rome and writing back to some of his friends who were still in England and hoping to join him was, you must look out for more musicians. We need more singers. We need more people who can play musical instruments, because that's so much an important part of the oratory. So that one of the things he did once he got back to England was to do precisely that, to use the talents of his friends to play music, not of a very sophisticated level. One of the things that, as I say, he experienced in Rome was the exercises of the oratory there, which he was disappointed with at first because he thought it was rather too much, concentrating on just musical performance and very little on the instructional side. What he wanted to do, you see, was to make music an integral part of what would be not merely entertaining, but would use the entertainment as a means of making whatever instruction he was giving more penetrating and more attractive. It was, to use a word that, as I mentioned before, a word that one of St. Philip's own followers, Neri, had used in an introduction to a set of music that he'd written in honor of St. Philip. It was allurement, adescamento is the word he used. And it's that idea of music as an allurement, as something which you draw people with through its beauty and make them therefore amenable to the truth that you then go on to expound to them. And of course, to draw them on through drawing them to the truth, to draw them further on also to their own commitment to a life dedicated to the service of the truth, the life of the sacraments, all of the moral life of the church, seen as a way in which we come closer to our calling to be remade in the image of God. So that was what he was looking at. That's what he was trying to do. And so in his musical oratories, obviously he would have to shape this, as he realized when he came back to England, according to the needs of where he happened to be. So in the very earliest instances, of course, he was in Maryvale, which is actually a large house outside the city of Birmingham. I mean, nowadays it's in a suburb of Birmingham, but when Newman was there, not far off 200 years ago, really, when you think about it, it was still out in the countryside. So it didn't have a large congregation or anything like that. So there wasn't very much scope for that sort of congregation. Then he eventually moved into the centre of Birmingham to a very, very poor part of the city called Derrit End. And there was very little opportunity for anything very elaborate, because the people that he was serving were so poor that their needs were just overwhelming. And he and his companions spent all their time and energy just simply trying to provide for their physical as well as their basic pastoral needs. And so education of the most basic kind is one of the things that they turned their attention to, as well as, of course, other forms of practical assistance and benefit as well. So it wasn't really until they moved eventually to Edgbaston in 1851, 1852, that he was at last living in a part of Birmingham where it was possible to form that kind of group of people who would be interested in music and find in music something that would draw them deeper into the mysteries of the faith. Which is not to say he found himself in an entirely sophisticated part of the world. There was no part of the city of Birmingham that didn't have a lot of difficult problems and many poor people to serve. And he never at any time abandoned or neglected those. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because obviously we're used to thinking of Newman in terms of the influence that he had on many of the intellectual people and on the children of his fellow converts in his school and then the university and such like. But in fact, we can easily overlook what is not necessarily so obvious to us after more than a century away from this time, that he was also serving the needs of the poor as well. So all that he did, and this is the point that it comes back to really, was shaped by the needs of the people he served at the time. And this didn't necessarily mean that he was able to offer a very sophisticated musical program. And that's one of the reasons why he looked out for, in the 1850s particularly, he looked out for popular tunes. It's something, again, we were talking about yesterday, that he looked for popular tunes, which as an Anglican, he would actually have positively despised and been horrified at. But as a Catholic priest looking after the needs of so many people who were very poor and who weren't sophisticated in many ways, he found that it was one of the best ways of drawing them in and helping to move them into a deeper appreciation of the truths and the practice of the faith. So I think that's the way that I'd want to characterize it. It wasn't necessarily very sophisticated what he was doing in his early years as an Oratorian. That probably didn't increase until the 1860s, when, as I mentioned before, he was running the school largely for the children of his friends, his fellow converts. And so he had a growing body of boys to educate, and particularly, of course, to educate musically wherever possible. And that led to a much more sophisticated kind of program of music, which, again, we've already been talking about. And, of course, Newman had the opportunity, once again, to pick up his own violin and to reacquaint himself with so much of the musical repertoire that he'd known as a young man, and to introduce the boys to that repertoire as well.
Of course, it's worth mentioning before we move on that the oratory from its beginning has been associated with great music. In fact, the musical genre, the classical music form of the oratorio, takes its name from the oratory of St. Philip Neri. And that's because a number of great composers frequented the exercises of the oratory and at the time of St. Philip and wrote music for it, such as Palestrina and Victoria and people like that.
I think I probably just ought to say, that in case I'm accused of being a little bit too chauvinistic about that, although, of course, there is a strong connection, and you're quite right to make it, between oratorio and the oratory. Strictly speaking, the musical form of oratorio, which did certainly begin in Rome, is not only associated with St. Philip's oratory. There were other institutes called oratorios, and the word oratorio, of course, originally just means a place which we would call an oratory. There were the other oratories, which were not St. Philip's foundations at all, but usually they were kind of confraternities, as we would call them, particular groups of laymen, generally laymen, of course, rather than anybody else, who would come together with some particular kind of charitable or pastoral work in mind. So there were confraternities to serve the needs of prisoners, confraternities to serve the needs of praying for the dead, confraternities who went to serve in the hospitals, and such like. So they were voluntary groups of laymen who did this. But part of their identity was that of actually meeting together in a particular chapel or meeting place and having religious services. And some of these were noted for musical oratorios, as they became called. The interesting thing about what St. Philip did, and this is definitely true for him, is that whereas some of these other oratorios, these other oratories, were sometimes quite sophisticated and learned and produced work in Latin, St. Philip was quite famous for preferring to produce works in Italian so that they would be accessible to a wider group of people, whereas the Latin oratorians were, naturally enough, only really accessible to the more educated and learned. So St. Philip's approach was very much connected with the vernacular oratory. And I think that's probably where his influence and the influence of the oratory, the Philippine oratory, is really greatest.
Oh, okay.
And certainly there was quite a lot of that. You mentioned Palestrina. Of course, Palestrina didn't write oratories as we understand them, oratorios as we understand them at all. That really didn't happen until the next generation of Oratorian musicians. And I've already mentioned the name of Neri. He would have been, I suppose, the earliest among the Oratorian musicians to present anything that had a kind of programmatic form. So that whereas what people like Palestrina would have done would be to provide musical settings of particular text, and especially one of the most famous texts that St. Philip particularly was devoted to was that of the Song of Songs. And Palestrina wrote a very famous group of motets or madrigals, spiritual madrigals, I think you'd probably call them, settings of words from the Song of Songs, which I'm absolutely sure in my own mind were written specifically for St. Philip, although that's something we haven't got any written evidence for. But given St. Philip's special love for the Song of Songs, and given that Palestrina wrote these settings, I think that there's a strong connection between them.
Right, very interesting. So before we wrap up, I'd like to ask about one more thing, more in the philosophical and theological realm again. That is some comments Newman made about similarities and differences between the experience of conscience and the experience of beauty. Now, of course, conscience is a very big topic for Newman. One interesting aspect of it is in both cases, you have the sense of something that is behind the mere experience of a sense of obligation or an experience of beauty in a sensible object. But in the case of conscience, he says the difference is that with conscience, you sense a personal voice in a way in which you don't with the experience of beauty in an object. Can we talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think that's very well worthwhile trying to explore that point, because I think what Newman's doing there, of course, is trying to explain the nature of conscience as a voice, and as a voice implying a person. And furthermore, of course, the voice of that person also issuing commands and prohibitions. It was that point, I think, that Newman was particularly anxious to make, because it's very, very significant that Newman himself, throughout his life, really from very early on, regarded that sense of the presence of God in his soul as being the fundamental experience that he had of both of God and of himself. He said there were There were two luminously self-evident beings, himself and his creator. And by that, he meant that he had an experience both of being himself and also of God being a presence within him too, and a presence around him. But a presence within him, above all, as a voice, to whom, therefore, he was utterly subject and responsible. And before whom, of course, he did not simply just feel an attraction of beauty in the Godhead, but also the absolute majesty of one to whom he owed absolutely everything and to whom he would have to give an account of himself. That's the sense, of course, of conscience that is so important. So it's really because I think he regarded conscience as being the most important evidence there is of the existence of God. He was far more swayed by the force of conscience as a sign of God's existence than he was of any other kinds of arguments. Because, I mean, obviously you can be convinced by any arguments as long as you have that particular cast of mind, so that you can be persuaded, of course, that there's an argument from form and an argument from teleology and such like. But he says these things only really convict you, if you already have a sense of the presence of God in you through conscience. So that's why he said it was possible for many people to live their lives and fully understand, for instance, external arguments in favor of the existence of God, but to be in no way persuaded by them. And of course, many people live like that nowadays, as we're only too well aware of. They may well be aware of arguments from order and such like, but are not in any way convinced by them and live life without them. You can be persuaded by them, but only if you already have a sense of the importance of God as a moral presence. And I don't, of course, mean by that the modern sense of morality, just a do and don't do, but rather the personal presence, one who commands you and who demands your love in return for the love that he gives you. That's the fundamental existence of conscience at the beginning of everything that he understands. You mentioned, of course, contrast between conscience and then about the beauty in the arts. I think that's the reason why he emphasizes conscience so much. It is the personality of God that lies behind that. In beauty, remember that we've already said that beauty is a sign to him of God. Conscience, therefore, for Newman, is the most important evidence of God. Beauty is something which can draw us towards God, but is not necessarily itself presenting God directly in the way that conscience does. So conscience is, as Newman calls it, the aboriginal voice of Christ in the soul. So it's a kind of direct personal presence. But beauty is indirect in the sense that it's not something which immediately speaks of God being present, but draws us on towards him.
Well, it's very fitting, because if beauty were to make such peremptory demands on us, I don't think it would be quite the same experience that it is.
No, and of course, nobody, therefore, who appreciated beauty could possibly fail to be drawn towards God. And I think that that's an important point which Newman has fully understood. So I think, again, it's a good example, really, of what Newman means about if you accept conscience, accept the meaning of conscience, then you can accept other arguments as well. That's why it is that for those of us who have the faith, beauty does quite naturally speak to us of God and does quite naturally draw us towards God. And we can perhaps more readily make distinctions between those aspects of beauty which do draw us to God and those which perhaps don't, again, which, of course, Newman himself has been talking about. But that's precisely what makes beauty a different kind of experience, because it can be perverted. It can also be devoid of that finality, that drawing us onwards towards God, which conscience, of course, as Newman sees it, is more directly leading us towards God. Or rather, it's a direct evidence of God rather than just something that leads us towards him, whereas beauty is a sign which we have to interpret in a sense.
So is there a sense that is there any truth to the idea that beauty might show us more of God's transcendence or of God's nature, whereas conscience lets us into the personal aspect of God more?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. That's a very good way of looking at it. Yes, beauty shows us certain aspects of God. I mean, as you know, of course, from the beauty as a transcendental, it's seen as the harmony between the various other transcendentals. Again, that's something which Newman doesn't talk precisely in those terms of the transcendentals as we find out in say, St. Thomas. But he does certainly see beauty as principally a kind of harmony and a proportion. And perhaps it's interesting, really, that harmony is the concept that he uses most tellingly and perhaps most instinctively, because I think he is, above all, by nature, a musician rather than a visual artist. And so, although obviously he does understand the importance of proportion in the visual arts, that beauty, of course, arises from that, I think what strikes him most, what completely compels him most in beauty, is oral beauty and the sense of harmony and proportion. He says harmony is the soul of music, and I think it's that sense, I think, which he finds most compelling about beauty and which draws him on to see it as a sign of God's infinite beauty, which I'm sure he would also say is to be found at its roots in the Trinity, that the Trinity is the ultimate harmony in the very heart of the Godhead himself.
Well, Father, I think we can wrap up there. But thank you so much, Father Guy, for coming on the show to talk with us about Newman.
And thank you indeed. It's been a great pleasure to do so, and I'm very grateful to you as well for asking me, and many blessings on your work. I think it's a wonderful thing.